Clive Crook, columnist for Bloomberg View, is here with us to break it all down. Thanks for joining us, Clive. First thing I want to do is sort of figure out what exactly happened in Italy, because it certainly seems like what they were going for with the referendum was something that had to do with making government more efficient and something pretty narrow and sort of mundane, and it took on much broader implications.
That's exactly right. I mean, it began as a narrow issue, a constitutional reform issue. The idea was to reduce the power of the Senate somewhat, so the lower house of Parliament, led by the government, led by Matteo Renzi, could actually get more things done. A lot of people objected to that, but that wasn't the main reason Renzi lost so badly in the referendum. It became, a way to channel other grievances, particularly about the European Union. And I think that's the real worry, that the referendum result marks a big step forward for anti-populist forces in Italy. So it's a kind of instance of a much wider trend we're seeing all across the European Union.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about that, but what happens in Italy now? He's going to step down, and the next election isn't scheduled until 2018. So
Right.
What happens in the meantime?
Well, I think that election probably will be brought forward, but in the meantime, there'll be a caretaker government. You know, this is a device that Italians are very used to, but it will be a government with no mandate, with no clear policy direction. The economic reforms that Renzi was working on are very likely to be halted, and in the meantime, the Five Star Movement, this party led by Beppe Grillo, the former comedian, who is, militantly anti-EU, militantly anti-elitist, those guys are going to be, mobilizing and doing what they can to do well in these parliamentary elections when they come around.
Now, this feeds into a bigger conversation about the populist movement in Europe and, quite frankly, around the world. Brexit,
right.
The election of Donald Trump. In Austria, the populist candidate did not win, but came very close, at least during the first election. They had to have a second election. What is behind this wave of support for populist parties, do you think?
Well, I think the common thread is anti-elitism. There are other elements that vary, in intensity from place to place. So anti-immigrant sentiment is certainly part of it. But I think the unifying idea is anti-elitism. In all these places, in Britain, in the US, and in much of the European Union, a lot of people have got it into their heads that their governments are not listening to them, that they have complaints that are being ignored. And they're voting against the political class, not even a particular policy program or a particular party. They're voting against the elite. They want to change. Obviously, it's dangerous. It's scary because it's so unpredictable. But I think that's the common thread, anti-elitism. So,
Clive, though, do you think there was a trigger? Because it all seems to be happening around the same time.
It does, and it's an interesting question. I think probably the Great Recession was the trigger. That's something all these countries endured. Very, very severe recession, a slow recovery, ongoing economic problems. I think that has destabilized politics as usual. People are asking, do the guys in charge really know what they're doing? The US actually has quite a good recovery going. By European standards. European economies are in very bad shape. Italy, for instance, is flatlining. I mean, they haven't had serious, respectable economic growth since the crash. That's years ago. So I think the recession is a big part of it. Then in Europe, of course, you have the additional sort of moral panic caused by the refugee crisis.
Right.
And this influx of Muslim immigrants from Syria and the Middle East. That has aggrieved a lot of people. They don't feel that the governments are dealing with it well. So that's another ingredient. Those two things together are probably, the spark that set this thing going.
Yeah, and that's certainly what helped to get Brexit pushed through when they added the element of concern over immigration and open borders and all that sort of stuff. And we're certainly seeing that conversation happening here in the U.S. as well.
Yes.
Clive Crook, columnist for Bloomberg View, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.